My daughter-in-law fired me just because I took 3 days off to mourn my wife, while my son stood right beside her, completely unable to meet my eyes, muttering coldly, "Mom's gone, Dad. You should just go home, stay quiet, and stop clinging to this old factory." Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for us to bring corporate clients here and see you standing around in that dirty work jacket? I held my late wife's small glass memorial urn tightly against my chest and walked silently out of the massive industrial building where I had devoted half my life. After losing everything, I bought back a rundown old bakery. They had no idea that this decision would soon force them to come begging at my front door. Before we dive deep into this story, drop a quick yes or no in the comments. Have you ever been discarded by the very people you sacrificed for? You are watching Silent Dad Revenge. Note that some elements are fictionalized for narrative impact. My name is Willard Prescott. I am 68 years old, and for 30 unbroken years, I was the first man through the heavy security doors at Ainsworth Foods in Buffalo, New York, every single morning at 4:45 a.m. The brutal winter ice on the sidewalk was often thick enough to crack a younger man's confidence, but in 3 decades, I never slipped, I never called in late, and I never gave management a reason to doubt me. I walked those vast industrial production floors before the giant baking ovens even warmed up, running my calloused hands along every cooling rack, pressing my thumb into every test loaf, and sending back any batch that wasn't exactly right. The younger workers called me obsessive. My longtime supervisor, Raymond Cole, called me the last honest pair of hands on the floor. I called it respect for the work, for the bread, and for the people who would eat it. I kept a small photograph of my beloved wife, Eleanor, tucked safely inside my work jacket every single day. 30 years of freezing early mornings, and she never once complained. She'd press a thermos of coffee into my hands at the door and whisper the exact same thing every time. "Come home in one piece, old man." I always did, until the morning I couldn't. Eleanor collapsed on our linoleum kitchen floor on a Tuesday in January. There was no warning, no lead-up. One moment she was humming an old hymn over the stove, and the next she was on the floor, and the universe I had built my life around simply stopped making sense. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. I held her hand in that kitchen for 11 agonizing minutes before the paramedics made me let go, and every one of those minutes carved something permanent out of my chest. My knees buckled so hard I had to grab the counter to stay upright. I pressed her hand against my face and wept harder than I had since I was a boy. I called Raymond Cole. At 5 the next morning, my voice barely holding together. "Raymond, it's Willard. Eleanor passed away yesterday. I need 3 days. Just 3 days for the service." Raymond's voice broke instantly. "Willard, my God, take whatever you need. I'll handle it on this end. Don't worry about a thing." What I didn't know was that Raymond Cole had been replaced the week before. Garrison, my own ambitious son who was now executive director, had quietly transferred Raymond to a satellite office and installed a corporate loyalist named Patrice Holloway in his place. Patrice Holloway, who reported directly to my daughter-in-law, Clarissa. Patrice Holloway, who never received my bereavement call, or perhaps received it and understood exactly what corporate games were expected of her. I came back on the 4th day with Eleanor's small glass memorial urn tucked securely inside my coat pocket because I couldn't bear to leave her home alone. I walked through the exact same entrance I'd walked through 7,000 times before, nodded to the security guard, and headed toward the locker room. But Clarissa was waiting in the main hall, standing at the front of a gathered crowd of shift workers, holding a thin manila folder with an expression of cold, manufactured corporate control. "Willard," her voice carried sharply across the factory floor, "we need to address your unauthorized absence." My chest tightened. Something in her clipped precision told me this wasn't a conversation. It was a performance. "I called it in," I said, hating how rough my voice sounded, still raw from grief. "I spoke to Raymond. Raymond Cole is no longer your supervisor," Clarissa stated smoothly. "And no approved leave request exists in the system. What does exist is a record of 3 consecutive days of unexcused absence during a critical production audit window. Under Section 14B of your agreement, that constitutes willful abandonment of your post." The words hit me like a physical blow. My hand moved instinctively to my coat pocket, gripping Eleanor's urn so hard my knuckles ached. "My wife died," I cried out, my voice cracking straight down the middle. "Eleanor died. I buried my wife." Clarissa set the manila folder down on a nearby table. "And we are deeply sorry for your loss. But grief does not override contractual obligation. Effective today, your employment is terminated for cause." I looked past her, searching for Garrison. He was standing 20 feet back, arms crossed, jaw set, staring fixedly at the concrete floor to the left of my boots. He couldn't even look at me. 30 years of sacrifice, and his own father was standing before him broken, while he studied the floor tile like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Garrison," my voice came out like gravel and smoke. "Son, look at me." He raised his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Something moved across his face, shame perhaps, or the ghost of it, and then the professional mask slammed back down. "This is a business decision, Dad. It's not personal." My heart didn't just break, it collapsed inward. With shaking fingers, I reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out the gold-plated 30-year service pin Ainsworth had given me, engraved with my name, and set it on the folder in front of Clarissa. The pin rattled against the paper. 30 years, I whispered, my voice giving out completely. 30 years, and this is what it counted for. I walked out through those heavy doors into the Detroit wind, hitting me like a fist, carrying Eleanor in my pocket and absolutely nothing else in the world. The transition from the warmth of a 30-year career to the crushing silence of unemployment was not a gradual decline. It was a freefall into an abyss I never imagined possible. My life was compressed into a tiny 2-bedroom rental on Maplewood Avenue. A house that had never felt large, but now, in the wake of Eleanor's passing and my sudden termination, it felt like a tomb. I was 68 years old, a man whose hands knew only the rhythm of production lines and the precision of honest work, suddenly finding himself calculating the cost of survival with the cold, unforgiving math of a pauper. My monthly Social Security check arrived like clockwork, a meager $940 that stood as the only barrier between me and the frigid Buffalo streets. After handing over $780 for rent and struggling through the utility bills that seemed to balloon in the dead of winter, I was left with a sum so small it felt like an insult. I lived on coffee, stale bread, and the heavy, suffocating memories of a life that no longer existed. The days stretched out into endless gray loops of misery. I woke up at 4:45 a.m., purely out of habit, staring at the ceiling until the sun begrudgingly poked through the frost-covered window. I spent my mornings scouring job boards and visiting every industrial facility across Buffalo, from packaging plants to distribution warehouses. I sent out 12 detailed applications in the first 2 weeks alone, seeking anything: floor supervisor, quality control, even janitorial work. I was not a man who shied away from labor, and I certainly wasn't a man who expected charity. I was a man who wanted to earn his bread. But every single attempt ended in the same humiliating rejection. The script was always identical. The hiring manager would glance at my resume, pause at the section detailing my last employment, and their eyes would inevitably fixate on the phrase "terminated for cause." It was a scarlet letter, a professional death sentence meticulously crafted by my own son and his ruthless henchwoman, Clarissa. It was a digital shackle designed to ensure I would never work in this industry again, branding me as an unreliable, insubordinate liability. I walked into offices with my head held high, my resume polished, and my 3 decades of perfect attendance etched into my soul, only to be met with shifting gazes and rehearsed apologies. They didn't see the man who never missed a shift. They saw the red flag in the system. The rejection wasn't the worst part. It was the pity in their eyes. The condescending way they talked down to a man who had forgotten more about food production than they would ever learn in their lifetimes. The turning point came on a cold Thursday morning when I walked into a regional food distribution center on the outskirts of the city. I was interviewed by a young woman, perhaps no older than 30, who looked at my paperwork with a weary, distracted eye. She was clearly overworked, buried under a mountain of files, but she seemed to possess a shred of decency that the previous managers lacked. She asked me about my background, and I told her the truth. I spoke of the 30 years at Ainsworth, the transition in management, and the tragic loss of my wife. I saw her expression soften, and for a fleeting moment I thought I had finally found someone who understood. But then, as she prepared to conclude the interview, she stopped, her gaze lingering on the termination remark. "Mr. Prescott," she began, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with an apologetic tone that made my skin crawl. I really want to help you. Your experience is undeniable. But I can't hire you. In fact, I don't think you're going to find work anywhere in this sector." I felt a cold shiver slide down my spine. "Why? Is it the termination record?" She hesitated, looking over her shoulder as if making sure no one was listening before leaning in closer. "It's not just the record, sir. 2 days ago we received a call, an anonymous call, or rather, a call from a representative within the Ainsworth HR department. They didn't just mention the termination. They explicitly warned us that you had developed significant psychological instability. They claimed you were prone to outbursts, that you were antisocial, and that you had been actively sabotaging equipment before you were let go. They essentially blacklisted you as a workplace threat. I'm telling you this because I don't believe it. You don't look like a saboteur to me, but my hands are tied. They've made it impossible for you." I sat there in the plastic chair, the world spinning in slow, nauseating circles. They weren't just taking my job. They were actively incinerating my character. Garrison and Clarissa had weaponized the entire HR system of the city against me. I wasn't just an old man who had been fired. In the eyes of every prospective employer in Buffalo, I was a mentally unstable, vindictive, dangerous criminal who couldn't be trusted within 10 feet of a production machine. They had turned me into a pariah, a ghost of the man I once was, systematically stripping away my identity, my pride, and my right to exist in the industry I helped build. I left that building in a daze, the icy buffalo wind biting through my worn jacket, but I felt nothing. The rage had burned itself out, replaced by a hollow, ringing silence. I walked for hours, aimlessly navigating the industrial outskirts, feeling the weight of the city pushing down on me. I thought of Eleanor's photograph on my mantle, the way she would have been appalled at the pettiness of the cruelty I was facing. She would have told me to stand tall, but how do you stand tall when your own son is the one trying to bury you alive? I was 68, I was broke, and I was now officially a pariah. Every door in Buffalo had been slammed shut, locked, and bolted from the inside. I returned to Maplewood Avenue as the sun set, sitting in my darkened kitchen with the silence pressing in from all sides. I had no job, no legacy, and now, no reputation. But as I sat there in the gathering dark, a strange, grim clarity began to take root in my mind. If they wanted a ghost, if they wanted a broken man, they would get exactly what they expected. But they had made one catastrophic mistake. They had assumed that a man with nothing left to lose is a man who will simply roll over and die. They were wrong. The walls they had built around me were high, and the bridges were burned. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the man who had been through the fire of the factory floor for 30 years. I knew exactly how to endure the heat, and I was just beginning to realize that the heat was about to turn up on them, not me. I had survived the winter ice of Buffalo for 30 years. I would survive the cold-blooded treachery of my own family. The hollow silence of my life on Maplewood Avenue had become unbearable, a constant, low-frequency hum of grief and financial ruin. One bleak February afternoon, feeling as though the walls of my own home were physically contracting to suffocate me, I grabbed my coat and drove without destination. I needed the city to blur past my windows so I wouldn't have to look at Eleanor's empty kitchen, or the ceramic rooster that still sat on the windowsill, mocking me with its frozen, cheerful painted face. I drove aimlessly for hours, letting the Buffalo frost guide me through neighborhoods I had long ignored, ending up on the outskirts of the industrial district. There, on a stretch of Lafayette Street that time and prosperity had seemingly forgotten, I pulled my truck to a stop. The sidewalks were heaved by decades of bitter frost, and the storefronts were narrow, hunched, and gray. My eyes were drawn to a small, derelict building with butcher paper half peeled from its windows and a sign so faded it was practically invisible. But something about the building pulled at me, a phantom memory of flour, warm wood, and the yeasty, living scent of fermentation that seemed to seep through the ancient, rotted window frames. It felt like a ghost of a life I used to recognize. An older woman was fumbling with the heavy deadbolt on the front door, her shoulders slumped under the weight of an invisible burden. As she turned, she caught sight of me standing there on the sidewalk, and her eyes went wide with a shock that bordered on reverence. "You're Eleanor's husband?" she whispered, pressing one withered hand flat against her chest. "Lord have mercy, you're Willard Prescott." My throat tightened, the familiar burn of grief returning instantly. "Yes, ma'am. I am. I'm Cordelia," she said, her voice soft and fragile, the way people speak when they are carefully carrying someone else's sorrow alongside their own. "Eleanor used to come in every Saturday morning, just before the first frost. She talked about you every single time, about the bread, about your work, and about the dream you were too afraid to chase. How are you holding up, honey?" I tried to force the word fine out of my mouth, but it died in my throat. I simply stood there, a broken man in the middle of a dying street. Cordelia reached into the pocket of her heavy wool coat, pulled out a tarnished brass key ring, and held up a single older iron key, worn smooth by decades of handling. "Come inside," she urged. "There is something in the basement I've been waiting for someone to see. Someone who understands the weight of these things." The basement stairs groaned beneath my weight, a protest of rotted wood that felt like a warning from history itself. Cordelia descended slowly, holding a flashlight in one hand and the iron railing in the other, moving with the quiet, practiced confidence of a woman who had made this descent 1,000 times before. I followed, my bad knee complaining with a sharp, familiar jab of pain, my hand trailing along the damp, cold brick wall. When the flashlight beam finally swept across the room below, I stopped dead, my fingers locking onto the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. There were hundreds of them. Cast iron baking molds, stacked floor to ceiling along every damp wall. There were heavy, rounded pans, long baguette trays, and Pullman loaf molds, all black with decades of seasoned carbon, radiating a dense, permanent warmth even in the heart of that frozen cellar. They were solid, permanent, and indestructible. I stepped off the last stair, my heart hammering, and reached out to touch the nearest mold. The iron was cool, smooth, and perfectly weighted under my fingertips, a tool made for an era when things were built to last, not to be discarded. "Good Lord," I whispered, the sheer volume of history in the room overwhelming me. Where did all of these come from? Cordelia's face broke into a smile that was so full of pride and sorrow that it made my chest ache just to look at her. My mother bought the first dozen in 1958. I added to them every year I ran this bakery. Cast iron from the 50s holds heat differently than anything they make today. It bakes from the bottom up, and it gives you a crust that a modern convection oven couldn't produce in a million years of trying. It's slow, Willard. It's patient. I picked up a medium loaf pan, feeling the extraordinary weight of it. It was like holding something that had decided it wasn't going anywhere. My eyes went hot, the threat of tears constant and stinging. Cordelia, I can't take these. These are your life's work. She crossed the floor and placed both of her hands over mine, pinning them around the iron mold. Her grip was firm, surprisingly strong. Willard, listen to me. Eleanor told me about your dream every Saturday morning for 15 years. She said you had hands that understood the soul of bread, but a heart too cautious to use them. She isn't here to push you anymore, so I am doing it for her. As I stood there, trembling, my eyes wandered to a scarred wooden workbench tucked into the far corner, illuminated by the dying light of the flashlight. Tucked under a heavy paperweight was a small leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed and stained with flour. I stepped forward, sensing something magnetic, and opened it. My heart nearly stopped. It was Eleanor's handwriting. Pages of detailed observations about wild yeast, about the chemical interaction of native bacteria, about the wild apple yeast. She had spent years researching in the local library back when we were first married. She had meticulously mapped out the variables of fermentation, temperature, and hydration, a scientific blueprint for the perfect loaf, something she had never told me she had ever fully committed to paper. A wave of electricity surged through me, a profound, chilling connection to the woman I had lost. She hadn't just been dreaming. She had been preparing a path, laying out the foundation for a future she knew I would eventually need. The notebook was a bridge between our past and a future I had thought was destroyed. It wasn't just a recipe, it was a mandate. She had been waiting for me to find this, waiting for the moment when my life at the factory became a cage, and the bakery became my only liberation. The yeast was more than a living culture. It was a manifestation of her belief in me, a wild, breathing legacy I could cultivate. Every morning, Cordelia said, her voice cutting through my epiphany, you set aside a bag for the children on this block. They come before school, and for some, it's the only thing they'll eat before noon. Every morning, I promised, and I meant it with everything I had left. I realized then that my revenge would not be a bomb or a shout. It would be a loaf of bread, fermented with the spirit of the woman they had cruelly dismissed, crafted with the iron of a generation that understood value. I stood in the dim light of the basement, holding Eleanor's notebook and a piece of cast iron, and for the first time since the kitchen floor in January, I didn't feel alone. I had the tools, the blueprint, and the stubborn yeast that had survived in the dark, waiting for the right hands to wake it up. The cage of my grief began to unlock. My son and his wife had tried to delete me from their world, but they had fundamentally misunderstood who I was. They had tried to bury a baker, but they had forgotten that I was a seed, and I was just beginning to grow. The first 7 days in the drafty, echoing kitchen of the Lafayette Street Bakery were a masterclass in humbling defeat. I felt like a novice again, fumbling with wild yeast cultures that refused to thrive, my knuckles aching as I kneaded dough that either came out as dense as a brick or collapsed into a sticky, unrecognizable puddle. I spent hours standing over my jars of fermented wild apple yeast, talking to them, coaxing them, and occasionally, when the frustration threatened to boil over, begging them to show some sign of life. Come on, Eleanor believed in this. I would mutter to the empty room, feeling like a fool, yet unable to stop. The first 3 batches were absolute disasters, discarded into the trash bin with a heavy, aching heart that felt like it was breaking all over again. But on the 4th night, something shifted. I stopped trying to force the flour and water into the rigid synthetic parameters of a factory process and started listening to the material. I extended the fermentation time, adjusted the hydration levels by feel, and let the wild yeast dictate the pace. When I finally pulled the 4th batch from the cast iron mold at 2 a.m., the crust shattered under my thumb with a sound so clean, sharp, and resonant that I actually gasped aloud in the silence. It was a sourdough loaf with an open, irregular crumb, a nutty, complex sweetness, and a deeply caramelized crust that only decades of seasoned iron could produce. It tasted like patience. It tasted like redemption. My granddaughter, Tabitha, arrived that weekend, blowing through the bakery door with a backpack slung over one shoulder and an aura of pure, focused energy. The moment she saw the ancient cast iron molds stacked floor to ceiling, her eyes went wide. She spent the next 2 hours turning the bakery into a digital storefront. She set up an Instagram page and a Facebook account, capturing high-definition shots of my flour-dusted hands, the bubbling wild yeast starter, and the loaves cooling on the wooden racks. She didn't just post pictures, she told my story. She wrote about the 30 years of loyal service at Ainsworth, the cold-blooded termination on the day I buried my wife, and the small, defiant dream of an old man refusing to be erased. She posted it with the caption, "My grandfather spent 30 years feeding buffalo, only to be thrown away. Now he's back, one loaf at a time." The response was not immediate, but when it hit like a tidal wave. By the following Tuesday morning, a line of customers stretched past Earl Watson's shop and bent around the corner of Lafayette Street. They weren't just buying bread. They were buying a story of resilience. People who had heard of the Prescott legacy from their parents showed up in droves. By the end of the week, a feature article hit the front page of the Buffalo News with the headline, "The Resilient Baker of Lafayette, How Willard Prescott Rose from the Ashes." The news didn't sit well in the high-rise offices of Ainsworth Foods. When Clarissa read the article on her smartphone, I was told by a mutual acquaintance that she threw her tablet across the conference room. To her, I was supposed to be a forgotten memory, a statistical error in her HR database, not a local hero. Driven by a toxic mix of arrogance and pure, unadulterated spite, Clarissa and Garrison decided to take matters into their own hands. On a busy Saturday morning, as the line for my bread reached its peak, a black SUV pulled up aggressively to the curb. Out stepped Garrison and Clarissa, dressed in expensive designer wear that looked entirely out of place on our gritty street. They didn't come to talk, they came to destroy. Clarissa held her phone up, the camera lens pointed directly at me as I stood behind the counter, my apron covered in the honest flower of a morning's labor. "Look at this, everyone." Clarissa's voice rang out, shrill and calculated, designed to carry over the entire shop. She swept the camera around the bakery, her tone dripping with venomous mockery. "Garrison, look at your father, 30 years of executive leadership down the drain, and now he's playing baker boy in a dump like this. It's pathetic. A confused, senile old man peddling overpriced, burnt bread to gullible fools." She turned the camera on me, her smile a razor-thin line of cruelty. "How's the charity business, Willard? Are you playing house, or are you just too delusional to realize you're a national embarrassment to the Prescott name?" Garrison stood behind her, his arms crossed, a sneer plastered on his face. He didn't say a word, but his silent, condescending smirk was worse. The entire bakery fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. My hands gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wanted to scream, to throw them out, to tell them exactly what their integrity was worth. But then, I caught Tabitha's eye. She was standing by the window, her phone also recording, and she gave me the slightest, most confident nod. I stayed quiet. I let them perform their cruelty for the world to see. Clarissa posted the video within minutes, tagging every local news outlet and influencer in Buffalo, expecting a wave of ridicule. Instead, she triggered an atomic-level backlash. The video didn't show me as a senile old man. It showed a man of quiet, unwavering dignity standing his ground against two entitled, vicious bullies. The internet, usually a place of apathy, rose up in a frenzy. Thousands of comments flooded Clarissa's feed. "Who raised these monsters? Willard is a king. I'm driving 2 hours to buy his bread just to spite you." The move backfired spectacularly. By Sunday, the line on Lafayette Street had tripled. People didn't just come for the bread anymore. They came to show their support. They came to buy a loaf and leave a note. They came to look Clarissa and Garrison in the eye, not literally, but by supporting the man they had tried to crush. I stood behind the counter for 14 hours straight, my hands shaking with exhaustion, but my heart filled with a warmth I hadn't felt in a decade. I looked at the line of people, the flower on my sleeves, and then up at Eleanor's photograph on the shelf. I had been fired, shamed, and abandoned, but in their attempt to break me, they had only succeeded in building my foundation stronger than it had ever been. I wasn't just a baker anymore. I was a man who had proven that the truth, no matter how quiet, would always outlast the noise. The viral backlash from Clarissa's failed smear campaign only served to solidify my reputation, but it also pushed my enemies into a state of deranged desperation. Garrison, blinded by the plummeting morale at his own headquarters and the public adoration poured onto my little shop, decided to weaponize the only leverage he had left: supply chain control. My regular flour supplier on Carpenter Avenue, a man I had done business with for months, met me in the parking lot on a gray Wednesday morning. His face was etched with a guilt he couldn't quite mask. "Willard, I can't fill your order," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. "It's nothing personal, but the big players are twisting arms. My distribution contract with Ainsworth is too important to risk for a few £100 of whole wheat." I tried 2 more suppliers that afternoon, and both delivered the same rehearsed, hollow apologies. It was a silent blockade, invisible, cold, and devastatingly effective. But Garrison and Clarissa were not content with just strangling my supply. They wanted my total destruction. On a humid Tuesday afternoon, Agent Rivera of the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, which handles regional FDA compliance, walked into my bakery, clipboard in hand, looking like a man who had seen every trick in the book. "Mr. Prescott, we've received an anonymous tip claiming your wild yeast cultivation process is a biohazard and that your facility violates sanitary codes," he stated with professional detachment. My stomach lurched, but 30 years of factory quality control kicked in like a dormant reflex. "Everything is documented, Agent," I replied, my voice steady. "I have the logs, the temperature charts, and the ingredient sourcing. Please, inspect whatever you need." Agent Rivera spent 3 hours combing through every inch of the Lafayette Street bakery. He checked the hydration ratios, the surface cleanliness, and the temperature-controlled fermentation logs I kept in a meticulous spiral notebook. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted from skepticism to genuine professional surprise. "Mr. Prescott, I've inspected dozens of artisan setups in Buffalo, but I haven't seen a facility this compliant in years. Your logs are immaculate. You're receiving a Grade A certification effective immediately." As he gathered his things, he lowered his voice. "The complaint that brought me here, it contained extremely specific technical jargon regarding your unregulated production that an average person wouldn't know. It's highly irregular. I'm required to document this." That irregular complaint proved to be their undoing. Because Clarissa had been so specific in her malicious report, she inadvertently triggered an automatic, high-priority review of Ainsworth Foods' own regulatory history. The inspectors, already on site in the region, decided to pivot and perform an unannounced, comprehensive sweep of Ainsworth's secondary processing lines. What they found was a nightmare for Garrison's efficiency-first empire, a synthetic dough conditioner that had never passed federal approval, quietly integrated into their high-volume lines to artificially inflate profit margins by 11%. The news hit the market like a seismic shock. On the very morning Garrison was scheduled to sign a massive, multi-million-dollar expansion contract with a major national retail chain, the FDA published a blistering formal warning letter against Ainsworth Foods, citing the use of unapproved synthetic additives. The timing could not have been more catastrophic. By the time the markets opened, the damage was irreversible. Traders, sensing the instability of a leadership team caught in a federal fraud scandal, dumped the stock in a frantic, blind panic. Ainsworth's valuation plummeted by 19% in less than 4 hours. I sat in the back of my bakery, watching the ticker tape on a small television in the corner, and felt a cold, jagged sense of irony. Garrison had spent months trying to starve me out, cutting off my flour, and sixing the law on a man who baked bread with his own 2 hands, all while his own house of cards was rotting from the inside out due to his own greed. His personal wealth, which had been heavily leveraged to finance his aggressive expansion and keep his lavish lifestyle afloat, was suddenly worthless. With the stock in free fall, his creditors began calling in his personal expansion loans, the very loans he had guaranteed with his Ainsworth equity. He was no longer a high-flying executive. He was a man trapped in a burning building of his own construction. The news reached my shop through the grapevine within hours. Customers were buzzing about it, and for the first time, I saw the true face of the Prescott legacy, not the gold-plated pin, but the cold, clinical truth of business ethics. Garrison's arrogance had left him with no backup, no loyalty, and no capital. He had been so focused on ensuring I had nothing that he failed to notice his own empire was built on quicksand. That evening, I sat in my quiet bakery, the smell of freshly baked rye acting as a balm to my spirit. I pulled out Eleanor's old photograph and set it on the flour-dusted counter, smiling for the first time in months. The justice I was witnessing wasn't personal. It wasn't a hit job or a scheme. It was the inevitable, crushing weight of reality finally catching up to 2 people who had spent their entire lives thinking they were above the rules. They had fought me with lies and sabotage, only to be undone by their own hunger for a shortcut. The irony was perfect. While they were busy trying to break an old man, they had forgotten that the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate, especially when that enemy has 30 years of experience in knowing exactly when a product is spoiled. The fallout from the Ainsworth Foods scandal was not a slow decay. It was an absolute, seismic collapse of everything Garrison and Clarissa had built on the foundation of greed. A week after the FDA warning letter turned the market against them, Thaddeus Pembroke, the chairman of the board and the brother of the woman who had quietly handed me the keys to my salvation, called for an emergency session of the board of directors. The resolution was swift, brutal, and historic. By a vote of 7-2, Garrison and Clarissa were formally stripped of their executive titles and unceremoniously removed from the premises by security. The independent audit that followed was merciless, exposing not just the synthetic additives, but the systemic culture of intimidation that had led to my own wrongful termination. Within days, the legal counsel of Ainsworth Foods contacted me with a comprehensive settlement package. My full, retroactive retirement bonus, complete medical coverage, and a $300,000 indemnity payment for the emotional and professional damages inflicted upon me during that freezing January. When Thaddeus Pembroke called me personally to inform me of the outcome, his voice was measured, carrying the weight of a man who had done the necessary, painful work of cleansing his company. "Willard, the settlement is finalized. You have your retirement and your restitution. And, if you're willing, the board would like you to return as the head of the new artisan division. We need the man who understands the bread, not the man who only understands the margin." I sat at my small, flour-dusted kitchen table, the early morning sun pouring in through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For a fleeting second, the old, ingrained reflex of a man who had been a loyal company soldier for 30 years pulled at me. The desire to go back, to fix what was broken, to restore the pride of the Ainsworth label. But then, I looked over at the shelves lined with my own cast-iron molds, the jars of wild yeast that I had nurtured from nothing, and the face of my beloved Eleanor captured in a framed photograph that had seen me through my darkest winter. "Thank you, Mr. Pembroke," I said, my voice steady, clear, and utterly devoid of hesitation. "But I have spent 30 years building someone else's dream. It is time I finished building my own." I declined the return. I took the settlement money and, instead of letting it sit in a bank, I funneled it directly into the expansion of the Lafayette Street Artisan Bakery, transforming that run-down, forgotten storefront into a hub of quality that was rapidly becoming the pride of Buffalo. The true reckoning arrived on a humid Tuesday afternoon in May. The door to the bakery chattered open, and in walked Garrison. The man who stood before me was a ghost of the executive who had once scoffed at my dirty work jacket. His impeccable suit was fraying at the cuffs, his eyes were sunken, and he moved with the hesitant, frantic energy of a man who had finally realized that the world doesn't care about his pedigree. He looked around the bakery, at the line of customers, the warmth of the ovens, and the sheer vibrancy of a business that was thriving without his corporate strategy. He stood there for a long moment, the silence between us thick with the debris of our broken relationship. "Dad," he croaked, his voice raw, stripped of its arrogance, "I need help. The loans, they're calling everything in. If you could just sign a guarantee, just enough to get the creditors off my back, I can pivot. I can fix this." He was desperate, looking at me with the eyes of a child who had never learned that actions have consequences. Then I saw Clarissa sitting in the black SUV at the curb, her face pressed against the glass, her phone raised, clearly waiting for me to succumb, waiting for the moment to twist the narrative one last time. I didn't say a word. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the gold-plated 30-year service pin that I had reclaimed from the firm. I placed it gently on the wooden counter between us. It glinted in the sunlight, a small, cold reminder of the loyalty he had discarded for 11% in profit margins. "I spent 30 years teaching you that a business is only as good as what it puts into the world, Garrison," I said, my voice calm, quiet, and absolutely final. "I taught you that people deserve to be seen, not used. You only ever learned how to take, and I won't give you one more thing to steal. Not my name, not my money, and not my peace." Garrison's jaw tightened, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. He opened his mouth to argue, to leverage, to plead, but the words died before they could find purchase. He looked at the pin, then at me, and saw a man who had finally become untouchable. He turned and walked out the door, the bell chiming a cheerful, indifferent note as he retreated to the black SUV, where Clarissa sat waiting for a salvation that would never come. I watched them drive away, their lives shrinking in the rearview mirror until they were just another pair of taillights fading into the city traffic. I turned back to the counter where Tabitha was waiting, a look of fierce pride on her face. I reached out and pulled her into a hug so tight we both swayed, the warmth of the ovens filling the room with the smell of home. The Lafayette Street Bakery was alive, thriving, and mine. That evening, after the last customer had left and the floor had been swept clean, I walked over to the small shelf I had reserved for the things that mattered. I set a fresh, crusty loaf of sourdough down next to Eleanor's photograph in her memorial urn. The crust crackled as it cooled, a sharp, clean musical sound that signaled the end of one life and the beginning of another. "We got here, Ellie," I whispered, the weight of the last 4 months dissolving into the air. "We finally got here." I had been a man who lost everything. A man branded as a threat and thrown into the cold Buffalo winter, only to discover that the fire was never in the factory, it was in the iron of my own character. Looking back, I realized that the most dangerous thing you can do to a man who has nothing left is to force him to build something of his own. If this story struck a chord with you, leave a comment below. I read every single one. Share it with someone who needs the strength to stand up, and subscribe to Dad's Ultimate Payback for more stories of quiet, unyielding survival. Remember, the true revenge is not in tearing your enemies down. It is in standing so tall, so far above their reach, that their shadows can no longer touch your light. Dignity is the one thing they can never steal unless you hand it to them. I chose not to. Stand tall, keep your spirit unbreakable, and always remember, you are the author of your own redemption.